The night air was crisp as a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of a sleek black SUV, his boots hitting the pavement with quiet authority. Dressed in a simple hoodie, dark jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson moved with the effortless confidence of someone who commanded attention, yet tonight he wanted none. He wasn't here as a Hollywood superstar, a former WWE champion, or a business mogul. Tonight he was just a man looking for a meal. The restaurant, Blue Flame Steakhouse, glowed under golden lights, its polished windows revealing a scene of elegance. Men in tailored suits, women in designer dresses, expensive wine swirling in crystal glasses. From the outside, it looked perfect, but The Rock knew better than to judge a place by its appearance. The real test lay beyond the surface. As he stepped inside, the scent of sizzling steaks and freshly baked bread filled the air, mingling with soft jazz music playing in the background. Heads turned, some eyes lingered on his massive frame, but most barely gave him a second glance. Perfect. He wanted to be treated like any other customer. Then the hostess at the front desk, Sarah, looked up from her tablet. Her gaze flicked over his casual outfit, and just for a split second, something shifted in her expression. Dismissive, almost smug. The Rock had seen that look before. It was the look of someone who thought they knew exactly who mattered, and who didn't. What happened next would change everything. Sarah, the hostess, arched an eyebrow as she scanned The Rock from head to toe. Her lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, wow," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Didn't expect to see you here." Nearby diners glanced over, their whispers barely concealed. Some chuckled, others pulled out their phones, intrigued by the presence of the massive man standing before them. But Sarah wasn't starstruck. She was mocking him. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone laced with false politeness. The Rock kept his voice calm. "Just looking for a good meal." Sarah laughed, shaking her head. "No reservation, huh? Well, lucky for you, we have a table right by the door." She snatched a menu and gestured toward the worst seat in the house, right in the draft zone, where the cold night air seeped in every time the entrance swung open. The Rock's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He followed her, feeling every eye in the restaurant on him. Some diners whispered, a few chuckled under their breath. They thought this was funny. They thought this was entertainment. Sarah dropped the menu onto the table without even looking at him. "I'll be back when I feel like it," she muttered before striding off. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The Rock sat, waiting. No water, no acknowledgement, no service. He watched as the waitstaff buzzed around, laughing with other guests, ensuring their glasses were full, their plates perfectly arranged. But at his table? Nothing. After what felt like forever, Sarah finally returned, looking bored and annoyed. "You ready, champ?" she asked mockingly. The Rock met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "I'll take the house special and a glass of water." She scribbled the order carelessly. "Sure thing." With a dramatic roll of her eyes, she spun on her heel and disappeared again. When his drink arrived, she slammed it onto the table, spilling some over the rim. Still, The Rock didn't react. He simply observed. Then came the food. The plate landed in front of him with a loud clatter. One glance told him everything: sloppy plating, dry steak, bland sides. This was intentional. They wanted him to feel small. What they didn't know? They had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The Rock ate in silence, every bite a confirmation of what he already suspected. This wasn't just about him. He saw how the staff treated others who didn't fit the restaurant's high society mold. The elderly couple in the corner waiting too long for their check. The young woman by the bar being ignored. This wasn't bad service, this was discrimination. As Sarah strutted back, tossing the check onto the table before he even finished, The Rock exhaled slowly. He reached into his pocket, pulled out cash, and left a generous tip. Not for Sarah, but for himself. A reminder that no matter how they tried to degrade him, he still walked out with dignity. As he stepped outside, he turned back, staring at the glowing sign of Blue Flame Steakhouse. This wasn't over. If you think The Rock should take them down, comment, expose them below, and don't miss what happens next, because the real fight is about to begin. Like and subscribe for part 2. A Silent Observer. The Rock watches. It all unfold. The Rock sat motionless at his cramped, drafty table near the entrance of Blue Flame Steakhouse, his massive frame barely fitting in the tiny chair they had thrown him into. A gust of cold air rushed in every time the door swung open, biting at his skin, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't here for comfort. He was here to watch. Across the dimly lit restaurant, waiters glided effortlessly from table to table, smiling, engaging, refilling wine glasses before they even had a chance to empty. They catered to the sleek businessmen in tailored suits, the wealthy couples with designer handbags perched carefully on their seats. But him? He didn't exist. Minutes dragged into 10, then 15, and still. No water. No waiter. No acknowledgement. The Rock wasn't a man who was easily ignored, yet here he was, treated like a ghost in a place he had just walked into. The weight of the situation settled deep in his chest. This wasn't bad service. This was deliberate neglect. Finally, Sarah strutted over, her lips still curled in that same mocking smirk. She leaned one hand against the podium, staring down at him like he was some uninvited guest at an exclusive party. "You ready, big guy?" she asked, barely masking her amusement. The Rock didn't blink. "I'll take the house special and a glass of water," she scoffed. "Sure thing." With zero urgency, she scribbled something onto her notepad, barely legible, careless strokes. She didn't even look up. Then, she was gone again. The Rock leaned back, watching. Waiters swarmed the restaurant floor, delivering plates of perfectly plated steaks, fresh seafood, golden brown sides. Across the room, a middle-aged couple laughed over their appetizers. A group of executives toasted with expensive whiskey. A young couple enjoyed candlelit intimacy at a prime corner booth. He saw who was valued in this place and who wasn't. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah returned, carrying a single glass of water. Instead of setting it down with care, she dropped it onto the table, the liquid sloshing over the rim, spilling onto the white linen tablecloth. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The message was loud and clear. The Rock exhaled slowly, his massive hands folding together as he stared at the wet ring forming beneath the glass. They thought this was funny. Then came the food. The plate landed in front of him with a dull thud, the silverware clinking against the ceramic. The steak was overcooked, dry, the sides lifeless, as if someone had thrown it together without a second thought. This wasn't just an insult. This was a challenge. Sarah barely concealed her amusement. "Enjoy, champ," she snickered before striding away. The Rock picked up his fork. He wasn't here for the food. He was here to see exactly how bad things could get. The Rock sat still, his expression unreadable as he stared down at the pitiful excuse for a meal in front of him. The overcooked steak, the bland sides, the careless plating, it was an insult, plain and simple. A deliberate, calculated message from the staff that he didn't belong here. He lifted his fork, speared a piece of steak, and chewed slowly. Dry, tough, flavorless. The Rock had eaten in five-star restaurants across the world, tasted Michelin-starred meals prepared by the best chefs on the planet. But this wasn't just bad cooking. This was malicious. He exhaled through his nose, lowering his fork, his mind already working through his next move. They thought they had humiliated him. They thought this was funny. They had no idea what was coming. Across the room, Sarah was laughing with another waiter, throwing a casual glance in his direction, nudging her coworker as if sharing some inside joke at his expense. His stomach coiled, but not with anger, with certainty. He had seen this before. People in positions of power who thought their status, their control, their little bubble of influence was untouchable. They always underestimated the wrong person. The Rock reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, tossing a stack of crisp bills onto the table. He left a generous tip, but not for them, for himself. A reminder, a marker, a silent declaration that no matter what they did, how they treated him, he would leave on his own terms. Then, without a word, he stood. As he made his way toward the exit, the restaurant hummed with an energy that had been there since he walked in. The hushed whispers, the glances, the half-hidden smirks. They thought he had just been put in his place. They thought they had won. The cool night air greeted him as he stepped outside, but the chill was nothing compared to the calculated fire now burning in his chest. He turned, looking up at the golden glow of the Blue Flame Steakhouse sign, the very place where they had tried to degrade him, where they had made it painfully clear who they thought mattered and who didn't. This wasn't over. The Rock slid into the driver's seat of his black SUV, gripping the wheel tightly as the pieces of a plan started to lock into place. They thought he was just another customer, just another nobody. They didn't know that in less than 24 hours, They wouldn't be serving him another plate of dry steak. They'd be serving him their resignations. Inside Blue Flame Steakhouse, the usual hum of conversation had been replaced with a tense, uneasy silence. The night had started like any other, until Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson walked in. And now, everything was falling apart. Sarah sat at the hostess station, her manicured nails drumming nervously against the wood. She kept refreshing her phone, but no matter how many times she checked, the result was the same. Her name, the restaurant's name, and The Rock's face were everywhere. News articles, social media posts, memes. Someone had recorded her little performance. The smirk, the snide remarks, the way she had paraded The Rock like a joke. Now the video was going viral at an uncontrollable speed. The comments were brutal. This is how they treat people? Disgusting. If they do this to The Rock, imagine how they treat regular customers. Boycott Blue Flame. Her stomach churned as thousands of furious people flooded the restaurant's social media, bombarding every post with outrage and one-star reviews. In the back, the kitchen staff huddled near the stainless steel counters, whispering in hushed, worried tones. "This isn't good," one of the chefs muttered, scrolling through his phone. "We're getting destroyed online." Carlos, a senior waiter, paced near the drink station, his hands clenched. He had been in this business long enough to know when a restaurant was in real trouble. And right now, they were in deep. Victor, the restaurant manager, burst from his office, his face pale and sweaty, his tie crooked from stress. His phone had been ringing nonstop. Corporate, journalists, furious customers, demanding refunds for reservations they had no intention of keeping anymore. His eyes darted around the restaurant, taking in the half-empty tables, the nervous glances from his staff. The place still looked the same, polished, upscale, expensive. But now it felt different. It felt cursed. "Nobody talks to the press," Victor snapped, adjusting his tie. "No comments, no interviews, no responses to messages. Understood?" The staff nodded silently, though the panic in their eyes was impossible to miss. Sarah swallowed hard. "You really think he's coming back?" she whispered. Victor didn't answer right away. He just stared at the front entrance, like a man waiting for a storm to break. Then, his voice came out low. "He said it on live video." Victor exhaled sharply, rubbing his temples. "He's coming back." A suffocating tension settled over the restaurant. The staff glanced at each other, dread creeping into their faces. Because for the first time ever, Blue Flame Steakhouse wasn't the one in control, and outside, the whole world was watching. The tension inside Blue Flame Steakhouse was unbearable. Every second felt like an hour. Every time the door chimed, the staff flinched, expecting the inevitable. Then, at exactly noon, a sleek black SUV rolled up to the curb. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the door swung open, and out stepped The Rock. The sidewalk exploded. Reporters rushed forward, microphones extended, cameras flashing like a chaotic thunderstorm. Bystanders whipped out their phones, recording, whispering, waiting to see what would happen next. Inside, Sarah's stomach dropped. Victor's hands tightened into fists. The restaurant staff froze, staring through the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching as the man they had humiliated the night before strode toward the entrance like a force of nature. The door swung open, and suddenly everything stopped. The air inside shifted, heavy and electric, like the moments before a lightning strike. Conversations cut off mid-sentence. Glasses, forks, knives, all movement ceased. The Rock didn't rush. He didn't need to. His presence alone filled the room, pressing down on every single person inside. He took slow, deliberate steps, his gaze sweeping across the restaurant like a silent reckoning. Sarah went pale, her hands gripping the edge of the hostess podium so tightly, her knuckles turned white. She opened her mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to excuse herself, but no words came out. Victor swallowed hard, his polished confidence cracking as he adjusted his tie with clammy fingers. The Rock stopped dead center in the room, and for a moment, nobody breathed. Then he spoke. "Let's get one thing straight." His voice was calm, controlled, deadly. "I don't do grudges. I don't do ego." His gaze flicked towards Sarah. "But what I do not tolerate is disrespect." The restaurant held its breath. Sarah's heartbeat pounded in her ears. Victor cleared his throat, scrambling for control. "Mr. Johnson, The Rock turned his head just slightly, but it was enough to make Victor shut up. "You knew what was happening in this restaurant," The Rock said, voice quiet but razor sharp. "You saw it. You let it happen. Victor's lips pressed into a thin line. The Rock exhaled, shaking his head. That's why, as of today, he turned slightly, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of what was coming sink in. You're done. Victor's face drained of color. Wait. The Rock raised a hand. Not a word. The room crackled with tension. The staff shifted uncomfortably. Some of them had laughed along with Sarah. Some had stayed silent, but they all had watched. And now? Now they were watching the consequences. The Rock's eyes landed on Sarah one last time. She looked away. She already knew. It was over. The reckoning, no more. Second chances. The weight of the Rock's words hung in the air, heavy and unshakable. The restaurant felt smaller, the walls closing in, the silence almost unbearable. Victor stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, as if still trying to process what had just happened. You're done, the Rock had said. The words echoed in his head, loud, final, inescapable. Sarah, still gripping the podium, felt her knees weaken. Her mind raced, grasping for an escape, an excuse, anything, but nothing came. She had spent the entire night laughing at the wrong man. And now, she was watching her entire world crumble in real time. The other staff members stood motionless, watching with wide eyes, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. Some had mocked him. Some had stood by and done nothing. But now? Now they all felt the burn of his presence. The Rock took a slow step forward. You think this is about me? He asked, his voice even controlled. But beneath it was a fire that could not be ignored. His eyes swept across the staff, stopping on each of them long enough to let the discomfort settle. This is about every single person you treated like they didn't matter. Every customer you ignored. Every person who walked in here expecting a meal and walked out feeling less than human. He let the words sink in, his voice never rising, never wavering. That stops today. Victor finally snapped out of his daze, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. Mr. Johnson, if we could just... The Rock's gaze landed on him again. And just like that, Victor shut up. The Rock turned his attention back to Sarah. Step forward. It wasn't a request. Sarah's stomach twisted, her pulse hammering in her throat. She took one step, then another. It felt like walking to her own execution. The Rock tilted his head slightly, studying her. You like power, don't you? He asked, almost conversationally. You like deciding who's worth your time and who isn't? Sarah said nothing. Here's the thing about power, the Rock continued. It's not given, it's earned. A pause. And you? He shook his head, his next words cutting deeper than any insult. You haven't earned a damn thing. Sarah's breath hitched. The Rock turned slightly, nodding toward a waiter standing nearby. Go get her final check. She's done. The waiter didn't hesitate. He disappeared into the back, leaving Sarah standing there, humiliated, powerless, drowning in the same arrogance that had once made her feel untouchable. It took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The waiter returned, holding an envelope. He set it on the podium in front of her. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for it, her mind still refusing to accept reality. The Rock took a step back, turning toward the rest of the staff. Everybody else? His voice hardened. Take notes. A chill ran through the room. Because this wasn't just about Sarah. This was a warning, and every single person in that restaurant knew it. A new era. The Rock reclaims his territory. The weight of the Rock's words settled over the restaurant like an unshakable storm. Sarah stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she clutched the envelope, the final piece of evidence that her reign of arrogance was officially over. The other staff members remained eerily still, absorbing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The rules of Blue Flame Steakhouse had changed, permanently. Sarah took a slow, shuddering breath before turning on her heel and walking toward the back. Her steps were stiff, robotic, as if she hadn't fully processed what had just happened. The Rock didn't watch her go. He had already moved on. Now it was time for the real work to begin. His gaze shifted toward the remaining employees, their faces a mix of fear, uncertainty, and something else. Hope. Some of you were part of the problem, the Rock said, his voice even controlled. Some of you stood by and said nothing. Some of you just did what you were told. A pause. But today, you get to make a choice. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. You can keep walking down the same road, where this place runs on arrogance, bad service, and power trips. Or ... He took a step forward, his voice lowering but gaining even more weight. You can step up. You can decide that from this moment forward, this restaurant stands for something better. Don't you think this is about me? He asked, his voice even, controlled. But beneath it was a fire that could not be ignored. His eyes swept across the staff, stopping on each of them long enough to let the discomfort settle. This is about every single person you treated like they didn't matter. Every customer you ignored. Every person who walked in here expecting a meal and walked out feeling less than human. He let the words sink in, his voice never rising, never wavering. That stops today. Victor finally snapped out of his daze, his hands trembling as he adjusted his tie. Mr. Johnson, if we could just... The Rock's gaze landed on him again. And just like that, Victor shut up. The Rock turned his attention back to Sarah. Step forward. It wasn't a request. Sarah's stomach twisted, her pulse hammering in her throat. She took one step, then another. It felt like walking to her own execution. The Rock tilted his head slightly, studying her. You like power, don't you? He asked, almost conversationally. You like deciding who's worth your time and who isn't. Sarah said nothing. Here's the thing about power, The Rock continued. It's not given, it's earned. A pause. And you? He shook his head, and his next words cutting deeper than any insult. You haven't earned a damn thing. Sarah's breath hitched. The Rock turned slightly, nodding toward a waiter standing nearby. Go get her final check, she's done. The waiter didn't hesitate. He disappeared into the back, leaving Sarah standing there, humiliated, powerless, drowning in the same arrogance that had once made her feel untouchable. It took less than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The waiter returned, holding an envelope. He set it on the podium in front of her. Sarah's fingers trembled as she reached for it, her mind still refusing to accept reality. The Rock took a step back, turning toward the rest of the staff. Everybody else? His voice hardened. Take notes. A chill ran through the room. Because this wasn't just about Sarah. This was a warning. And every single person in that restaurant knew it. A new era. The Rock reclaims his territory. The weight of The Rock's words settled over the restaurant like an unshakable storm. Sarah stood frozen, her fingers trembling as she clutched the envelope, the final piece of evidence that her reign of arrogance was officially over. The other staff members remained eerily still, absorbing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. The rules of Blue Flame Steakhouse had changed, permanently. Sarah took a slow, shuddering breath before turning on her heel and walking toward the back. Her steps were stiff, robotic, as if she hadn't fully processed what had just happened. The Rock didn't watch her go. He had already moved on. Now, it was time for the real work to begin. His gaze shifted toward the remaining employees, their faces a mix of fear, uncertainty, and something else. Hope. Some of you were part of the problem, The Rock said, his voice even controlled. Some of you stood by and said nothing. Some of you just did what you were told. A pause. But today, you get to make a choice. The staff exchanged uneasy glances. You can keep walking down the same road, where this place runs on arrogance, bad service, and power trips. Or ... He took a step forward, his voice lowering but gaining even more weight. You can step up. You can decide that from this moment forward, this restaurant stands for something better. Victor, the former manager, had already left in disgrace, his absence barely noticed. But now, those who remained had to face the truth. They had allowed this to happen. The Rock didn't sugarcoat it. From now on, every customer is treated with respect. No exceptions. No excuses. His voice cut through the silence like steel. If you can't handle that, his shoulders squared, his presence commanding every inch of space, then walk out that door right now. The tension in the air was suffocating, and then, a shift. A young server, no older than 20, took a hesitant step forward. I want to stay, she said, her voice small but steady. Then another, then another. Soon, one by one, employees nodded, a collective agreement that the toxic culture of Blue Flame Steakhouse was officially dead. The Rock nodded slowly. Good. Then, without another word, he turned, striding toward the door with the same unshakable confidence he had walked in with. As he stepped out into the bright afternoon sun, reporters and bystanders erupted with questions. But he ignored them all. His mission here was done. But this was only the beginning. The Rock didn't just expose a corrupt restaurant, he transformed it. But what do you think? Should he take this fight even further? Maybe launch a chain of restaurants that actually respect their customers? Or should he hunt down more corrupt businesses and expose them one by one? Drop a comment below and let us know what you think should happen next.